time, please use the raise hand feature of Zoom to maintain the queue. At all other times, please keep yourself muted to minimize the disturbances. Thank you.
Thank you, Naman. Good evening, all. Om Sthavakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmaswarupini avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. We are continuing our discussion on the foundational text of Indian philosophy, and during the last several sessions that we have covered, we are discussing some of the non-Advaitic or non-dualistic schools of philosophy, non-Advaitic, which are distinct from Shankaracharya's Advaita, Ramanuja, Madhva, Nimbarka. These three great thinkers we are discussing. And they are all called Vaishnava schools of Vedanta. And Chaitanya school also belongs to that category. Now, there is another system of philosophy that we didn't discuss so far, which it is in some ways very similar to Nimbarka's philosophy, which is called Dvaita. And the name of that great philosopher was Vallabha. So Vallabha lived in the 15th and 16th centuries. He was actually a contemporary of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who is the exponent of Achintya Bheda, from which ISKCON and the Hare Krishna movement, they drew their inspiration, their teachings, which actually it belongs to the lineage of Madhvacharya. So these are all different non-Advaitic schools of Vedanta. Broadly speaking, they belong to the category of Vaishnava systems of philosophy, which primarily focuses on one supreme divine reality, more like the monotheistic systems of popular Hinduism or Abrahamic religions, believing in one supreme divine God, anthropomorphic, with all attributes and forms and qualities and characteristics. So today we are going to take up Vallabha system. Vallabhacharya originally belongs to the southern states. He belonged to a Brahmin family of the same place, the same state, the same language group to which Nimbarka also belonged, the southern state of Telugu-speaking region of South India. Though he was born in Champaranya, somewhere in the northern states, in place close to what is now known as Madhya Pradesh, all these places. And his system of philosophy is very, very special. In some ways, it has got a close connection with some of the mystic Christian doctrines practiced and taught by the mystics of medieval times. The system is called Shuddh-advaita. And surprisingly, there is a close relation, kind of similarity between the system of Vallabha and the system of Ramanuja. Ramanuja believed in the concept of total surrender, though Vallabhacharya's interpretation and the name that he gives to this doctrine of total surrender is totally different. But it is essentially the same from a spiritual perspective. Ramanuja believed that when you are fully convinced of your own total helplessness, when you feel you are totally inadequate, you cannot take care of your own spiritual destiny, then you can completely surrender to the grace of God, which he calls Prapatya Sharanagati, total self-surrender. And he defines this as a spiritual doctrine with 6 different aspects. The most important, the central theme is surrender, But you also have to practice this Anugulyasya Sankarpaka Pradigulyasya Varjanam Rakshasyati Vishwasa Goptutta Varanam Tata Atma Nikshepa Karpane Shadvidha Sharanagati. Sixfold disciplines constituting this prapatti Sharanagati, or the doctrine of total surrender to God. First of all, you should practice a positive attitude. You should discard all negativity. You should have a strong faith that God will protect you, looking upon God as the only protector. And then you should also feel yourself to be totally inadequate. You should feel you're totally incapable of taking care of your own spiritual destiny by your own resources. And then Atma Niksheba, you totally surrender to the grace of God, which Ramanuja calls Saranagati or Prapatti. And he says that there are two central emotional or spiritual aspects to this. One is Akinchanyam, that is, you are totally incapable, you are destitute, you are totally helpless. Then Ananyagatitvam, you don't have any other refuge. God is the only refuge. So these two important doctrines are central to Ramanuja's system of total surrender. Now, coming to Vallabhacharya, Vallabhacharya says the most important and the central and the easiest and spiritually the most intense practice is surrendering yourself to God. This you can do at the very beginning. Now, before going further, I should explain this in some details. So, I am coming to that. In the Bhagavata Purana, which is the most important spiritual classic, devotional classic of Hinduism, it's called Bhagavata Purana, with 18,000 verses divided into 12 sections called skandhas, altogether about 335 chapters. It's a very important philosophical and spiritual and devotional masterpiece written by Vyasa. So in that book, it's mentioned that there are 6 ways of worshipping God in a ritualistic manner, and there are 3 other ways which are also important. Of the later 3, the last one is called total surrender. I mean, the Sanskrit statement is this: Sravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu, Smaranam, Padasevanam, Marchanam, Vandanam, Dasyam, Sakhyam, Atmanivedanam. These are together called 9 different disciplines in spiritual life, of which the first 6 disciplines constitute different spiritual practices meant for the ordinary spiritual seekers. So you listen to spiritual talk, spiritual music, hymns, or reading of spiritual books, holy books, and you chant the name of God. You can see this mostly in today's world. You can see among the Hare Krishna people, ISKCON people, they practice what they call the Mahamantra. In large groups, they chant, and you can see them walk in long processions, thousands of people, some hundreds of people, marching, chanting this divine name. It's called Mahamantra. That is called Kirtanam, means chanting loudly. So, you listen, then you are drawn towards this spiritual devotion, then you can join together with other devotees and you can recite loudly. Then you can think, in smaranam, you are thinking, you are contemplating you are remembering the holy name. And then you can practice service in a temple or a deity or in a spiritual place. You can do some service. And then you can do puja, worship. And you can bow down, showing your obeisance, your respect. These 6, according to Vallabhacharya, are the normal spiritual disciplines that could be practiced by any ordinary spiritual seeker, because they are more or less physical. See, you can chant loudly, you can listen, that is also more or less a physical activity. And then you can think, contemplate, remember, smaranam, or you can do some service. You can do external ritual worship, what you call prayers, prayer sessions taking place in many of the Christian churches are more or less the same. And vandanam, you mentally or as a spiritual practice, even physically, you bow down, you show your respect, your reverence to the deity, God. The 6 disciplines: Sravanam, Kirtanam, Smaranam, Padasevanam, Archanam, Vandanam. Now, these are technically called what Vallabha called Maryada. Now, you can practice all this, but you are bound by certain laws. You have some restrictions. You are able to practice all these disciplines only if your mind, if your samskaras, if your tendencies allow you to do that. Many people want to do wonderful things, but their own mind won't permit them to do. Their samskaras, the tendencies, the impressions, the innate characteristics will create stumbling blocks in their spiritual path. So you may want to go to a place, but your mind won't permit you. So, in a way, you are bound by your own natural tendencies and propensities. But still you may practice, but there are certain disciplines, certain methods that you have to follow when you practice these external spiritual rituals and disciplines. There are certain do's and don'ts, certain specific ways of doing your devotion in a church or a temple or any devotional place. You have to follow certain disciplines, you have to follow certain rules and regulations and conventions. Now, suppose you cannot practice all this. You are totally helpless, your mind is restless. People who you can find in this world, people who are really good with a strong spiritual aspiration, but mind is totally restless. Mind is not within their control. They cannot regularly practice certain conventional spiritual disciplines because their mind is not within their control. They are not so well disciplined as to follow regularly a specific spiritual path. Such people can do something else, that is Atma-nivedana, that is a 9th. So, Sravanam, Kirtanam, Smaranam, Padasevanam, Archanam, Vandanam. These are 6 special disciplines. They call Anushtanas. You have to follow certain do's and don'ts, specific rules and regulations. Now, there are people who cannot do this. What they should do? They should leave the entire responsibility to God. It is called Atma-nivedana. That is actually the 9th one. Sakhyam Dasyam. You can look upon God as your friend, or you can look upon God as your master. You yourself is a servant and God is the master. So these 2 disciplines are possible. But for that also you need the permission of your own samskaras and mind. People, you can come across such people in the history of spirituality. Sudden transformations. They led very indisciplined life, without any spiritual practices, mind highly disturbed. Suddenly they feel like taking a plunge into spirituality. Many of the mystics in Christian tradition, Hindu tradition, Buddhist tradition, they underwent this sudden transformation, the quick, sudden transformation. And then they take complete refuge in God, which in the list of Navadha Bhakti, it's called Ninefold disciplines we mentioned earlier, actually comes at the ninth. But Vallabhacharya says, you can begin with the ninth. What is the ninth one? The ninth one is actually total surrender. If you follow the conventional discipline, the conventional path, then Atma Nivedana, one's own self-surrender, comes at the very end. The people, suppose those who are given to, let's say, drug addiction, alcoholism, indisciplined lifestyle, but they have a strong spiritual aspiration. What they do? They cannot go to a church or a temple and pray and practice in spiritual disciplines. Given to alcohol, drug addiction, and so many other vices, but they have a strong spiritual aspiration somehow. So what they do? All right, I close the bargain. My responsibility belongs to you. They can leave the whole thing to God. But it cannot be a caricature. People sometimes tell you, I have given everything to God. Every Sunday you go and confess, and every Monday is the beginning of a new life, and you continue the same life. Next Sunday again confession. So confession can become a kind of informal license renewal program. In that case, this will not work. So Vallabhacharya says, it's called the Pushti Marga. It's a technical name in Sanskrit called Pushti Marga. Pushti in ordinary literary Sanskrit means nourishment. Now, surprisingly, some critics of Vallabhacharya sometimes makes fun of the system without any justification. They say, so it is a kind of Epicureanism, kind of egoistic hedonism. You have a good food, nourish your body, have a good life. That's a total wrong way of understanding Vallabha's philosophy. What Pushti in Vallabhacharya's system means is grace. When you have that grace, then your responsibility belongs to God. But if you sincerely believe that your spiritual responsibility belongs to God, then actually that responsibility will be actually taken by God. Then you become a tool in the hands of a higher power. But it requires a lot of sincerity, integrity and truthfulness and total identification. Otherwise it is not possible. Otherwise it becomes a caricature, it becomes a drama, a kind of self-deception. So it's like closing the bargain. Suppose you make a $100 donation, you give to your friend, this $100 belongs to you. And then after some time you ask you, what did you do with the $100 which I gave you yesterday? And you go on pestering him, nagging, going after him. What did you do with the money I gave you yesterday? That man, your friend, won't be happy. He may put it back on your face. Take away the money, I don't want you. So once we give our total responsibility to God, then there is no argument, there is no bargaining further. You close the bargain once for all. From that moment onwards, we begin a new life. So this is a real meaning of Vallabha's doctrine called Pushti. So it's called the path of the method of grace. That's a literal translation of this Pushti. That's something very unique in the philosophy of Vaishnavism. Actually, in a way, it's much more forceful, much more intense than any doctrine that you find in Ramanuja, Nimbarka, or Madhva, or any other Vaishnava philosopher, so Chaitanya. Because it requires an intense, totally sincere, very totally earnest way of total self-surrender. Once we actually do that, then you find it becomes almost impossible for us to do anything wrong. So it is the very opposite of this license renewal program. Complete total surrender. Now, this idea, Vallabha got this idea from Bhagavata Purana. In the Bhagavata Purana, Purana is the third most significant Hindu canon. The most important canon is the Upanishads, Jnana-kanda, the Vedas. The second category is the law books which teach you how to practice the way of Vedic life, the Vedic way of life. The third category is the category of Puranas. Puranas are semi-historical, semi-mythical, and semi-literary. So there is a literary aspect, there is a mythological aspect, there is also a historical aspect, because many of the Puranas contain very interesting insights into the history of Indian subcontinent. But again, there is a lot of myth, there is a lot of exaggeration, a lot of metaphor, and also a lot of stories, mostly fictitious stories. Now, there are two ways of understanding these Puranas according to traditional wisdom. One, according to one school, Puranas contain 5 important aspects. Or there are 5 important characteristics of Puranas. Called Puranam Panchalakshanam. Means Purana, if you remember, Puranas constitute the semi-mythological, semi-historical, some of them deeply spiritual works. Altogether, there are 18 important Puranas and 18 secondary Puranas. Primary 18, secondary 18. Altogether 36 Puranas. There is actually many more, but these are fundamental Puranas. Of these, Bhagavata Purana is very important. In that Bhagavata Purana, there is this description of 10 characteristics of Puranas. To understand the spiritual significance and the force of Vallabha's philosophy of pushti, we have to understand this context. So, among the 10 important characteristics of Bhagavata Purana, Atra Sargo Visargascha Sthanam Poshanamuteha Manvandara Ishanagata Nirodho Muktirasaya. These are the 10 characteristics. So, creation of this world, expansion of this world, then gradual evolution, then further development and expansion, and then stories of kings and emperors. There are dialogues from great saints, great mystics, and also there are descriptions of spiritual emancipation, and there are also description of the characteristics of God's grace. All these are included among the 10 characteristics of Puranas, especially of Bhagavata Purana, from which Vallabhacharya got this unique doctrine of pushti or God's grace, or the path of God's grace. So these are the 10 characteristics. There are also some other views about the definition of Puranas. Sometimes in some books it is mentioned that Puranas have got only 5 important characteristics. Sargascha pradisargascha vamsho manantrani cha vamshanujaridam jaiva puranam panchalakshanam. It's actually in a way a condensation of what we mentioned already. That is, a summary of the 10 characteristics mentioned earlier can be found in this important definition, which gives only 5 characteristics. Now, one important point. What is this pushti? So, this is a very important word in Vallabhacharya system. Pushti. Pushti, according to Vallabhacharya, means grace, grace of God. Totally different from what it literally means. Literal meaning is nourishment, expansion. But in Vallabha system, it means grace. How do you get this grace? When you find that your own efforts, all your attempts to start spiritual life, let's say you want to meditate. There are many people who want to meditate, but mind won't permit us to do, because mind becomes restless when you try to meditate. Switch on the TV, mind is happy. When you sit and contemplate, mind becomes unhappy. When you may want to read the Sermon on the Mount, but mind is not allowing. But mind is very happy when you read the newspaper, the local newspaper. Wonderful. So mind naturally goes towards something worldly, something empirical, something that has nothing to do with higher philosophy or spirituality. Because our mind is full of negative samskaras. And we try our best, but we cannot do what we want to do. Then suddenly you sit and think sincerely, well, I can't take care of my own spiritual life. I leave it to you. You give a responsibility entirely to God. Remember, here we should know what is the meaning of God here in Bhagavata Purana. God is the all-pervading divine reality, present in everyone, in everything. He is the God of everyone, not only of those who believe in Him. He is the God of even those who do not believe in Him. So Swami Vivekananda makes a very forceful statement, a wonderful definition of what it means to be spiritual. He says, you live your life in such a way that God accepts you even if you did not accept Him. So now, in the those who are interested, those we can keep this in their mind. Bhagavata Purana, 2nd Skandha, section 2nd, 10th chapter, 2nd verse. There is a definition of this Poshanam is the Sanskrit word from which the word Pushti Vallabhacharya took. Sthitir Vaikuntha Vijaya Poshanam Tad Anugraha Manantirani Sadharma Udaya Karma Vasana. So it means God's grace, God's natural grace. And out of that grace, when we become recipient of God's grace, then we become better human beings. Our spiritual life begins and we feel a kind of intense joy, contentment. We start looking upon everyone around us as part of our own spiritual family. So what it means is compassion, kindness, good feeling. All these higher qualities become natural when we become recipients of God's grace. And this is possible only when we totally surrender. That means kayena, manasa, etc. Means mentally, physically, verbally, in mind, in word, in thought, and in action. We totally surrender ourselves to God's will. When this becomes a sincere self-surrender, then our life begins to transform itself. And the first experience is we feel a kind of inner joy and contentment within ourselves. Nothing can shock us. If you look at the history of Vallabhacharya, there is a historical background behind it, Vallabhacharya lived at a time when India was facing a very serious social and cultural and political problem. That is time of Muslim invasion. Many temples were destroyed. Huge invasions taking place from Afghanistan, from what is now called Iran, at that time it's called Persia. So, India was divided into so many small little kingdoms. They were not a united country as it is now, but small tiny kingdoms. So I will come to that later. So there is a historical background, an historical reason, explanation why Nimbarka happened to develop this unique system of total self-surrender. I will come to that. Before that, a few more words about the operation of God's grace for a devotee. Vallabhacharya says, when you take complete refuge in God, you have to go to a teacher and you have to take a kind of initiation, and mentally you should renounce everything to God. And then there is a ritual involving uttering certain mantras, Sri Krishna Paramam, Mama, etc. I will come to that later. It will take some time for us to explain that. Lord Krishna is the only way. That's how you have to believe yourself. So when you do that, what happens is you have to completely Atma Nivedanam. You have to devote yourself entirely to God. When you do that, you are liberated from the entanglements of your own karmas. Otherwise, our own karmas, our own actions and their tendencies, we are already accumulated in the mental system, called samskaras. We will be always influenced by our karmas, our past, in the form of memories, thought currents, tendencies and impressions that come again and again in our mental system. So when we try to meditate, thinking of God, instead of thinking of God, we may start thinking of something else, because mind is full of negative thought currents, ideas and memories. So mind would not go to higher spiritual ideal. Then what happens is, we won't be able to make progress. But suppose we completely dedicate Atma Nivedana to Lord Krishna, then we are liberated from the entanglement, from the prison of our own karmas, our own vasanas, our own samskaras. And then we approach a teacher. This is mantra to be uttered, 84 letters. And when you do that, you renounce everything to God and you become a recipient of God's grace. Before that, whatever we try to do is called maryada. I mean, our actions, our spiritual disciplines, or our efforts to practice spiritual disciplines, bound by our own karmas, our own samskaras, may not work very well because we are bound by laws, by law of karmas. But he calls it Brahma Sambandha, means connecting with Brahman, connecting with Krishna. So Vallabhacharya's idea of God was Lord Krishna. So I say something about the cultural background, the historical background of Vallabha's system of philosophy. As I mentioned, Vallabhacharya lived at a time when there were a lot of political, cultural, religious conflicts in India. His family lived in Benares. His parents, when he was born, his parents were trying to run away from Benares, moving to South India, and he was born in a forest. His parents were running away for their life from Benares, there were rumors of invasion, Muslim invasion of the holy city of Benares. And when he was living, there were always problems, political, social upheavals in that part of India. So actually, there's a well-known book, Krishna says Stotram, Vallabha tradition, means Stotra, a hymn on taking refuge at the feet of Lord Krishna. He says, Mlecha akrandeshu deseshu pabaika nilayeshu cha satpriyada vyagralokeshu Krishna eva gatir mama. These are some of the mantras that you find in this Krishna says Stotra. I mean, Mlecha akrandeshu lokeshu, in this world, in different places, which are being attacked and assaulted by evil men, evil people, there is no other refuge than Krishna. Krishna is the only refuge. Gangadi tirthaviryeshu dushtaigra avurdeshu ka tirohidadi deveshu Krishna eva nama. Holy rivers like Ganga, Yamuna, Saraswati, all these rivers, holy places and holy men, they're all facing assaults and attacks, persecution everywhere. In such a horrible world, Krishna is my only refuge. This is how these poetical works end. So you can imagine the pathos, the devotional fervor of Vallabha. So in a way, one could say that Vallabhacharya's system is a product of his own times. How a group of people who were not given to any warfare, who were given only to life of contemplation, meditation, reading scriptures and worshipping God and all these spiritual disciplines. His own parents had to run away from Benares for their livelihoods. They originally belonged to the South Indian state of Andhra, Telugu-speaking people, but they were living in Benares, the most holy place for Hindus, spending their lifetime in meditation, reading scriptures, teaching scriptures. Is still a tradition that continues to our times. So when they heard about the imminent Muslim invasion, they ran away from Benares, Vallabha's parents. And on the way back in Champaranya, in forest region, in central India, he was born. So he's a product of his time. So he says, at a time, Mlecha akrandeshu deseshu papaika nilayeshu cha satpriyada vyagralokeshu Krishna eva gadir mama. Krishna is my only refuge. Lord Krishna is my only refuge. In a world, in a place which is afflicted by evil people who are destroying temples, who are destroying Hindu tradition. Gangadi tirtha varyeshu. So river Ganga, all these holy rivers are all being polluted, they are being destroyed. So ahangari vimudeshu satsu papa papanuvartishu labha puja yatneshu Krishna eva gadir mama. It continues like that. At a time when people who are to be respected or revered are not respected or revered or persecuted. In such a place and time, Krishna is the only refuge. This is how some of the works of the Vallabha tradition continues. What it means is, in a way, it is a product of his own times, culturally, socially and politically. Though at the philosophical level, Vallabhacharya, he was not very aggressive in the use of his language like Madhvacharya or even Ramanuja. Vallabha was a very mild, humble devotee of Lord Krishna, like Nimbarka, very similar to Nimbarka. Madhvacharya was very aggressive in his opposition to Advaita. Ramanuja was also somewhat aggressive, but not as much as Madhva. But Vallabha, on the other hand, was a humble devotee. So somebody who belonged to a community, who was given to meditation, reading scriptures and teaching scriptures, whose parents had to run away from a holy place for their livelihood. So, in a way, all this went deep into his system. So, he says, in such a situation, human beings are good people, virtuous people are totally helpless. So, Lord Krishna is the only refuge. So, it was a kind of devotional fervor and a feeling of helplessness you find. So, he says, in such a situation, we cannot do anything. We can only surrender ourselves, our fate to Lord Krishna. So he developed this unique way of connecting with the Supreme Deity called Pushti Marga, it is called, the path of Pushti, the path of God's grace. At the philosophical level, he was, of course, opposed to Advaita. So there is a well-known book, Shuddh-advaita Martanda, in which said, Maya sambandharahitam shuddham vidi uchyate budhaihi karya karana rupam hi shuddham brahma namayikam. Now, in Shankaracharya's system, he established that the supreme divine reality is one, divine truth, divine spark, present in everyone and present everywhere. Omnipresent, immanent and transcendent. This is the highest experience of the divine reality. So when we evolve in our spiritual life, our idea of the divinity also evolves. At the beginning of our spiritual life, we may think God is present in a holy place, in a holy shrine, in a temple or a church. If we go there, there is a special presence of God. That's perfectly okay. So Shankaracharya himself wrote the most wonderful devotional poetical classics in Sanskrit. But he also said that as we evolve in our spiritual life, then we realize, it's not a belief, but a realization, inner experience. We realize that God is one supreme divine principle, present everywhere, everything. And everything in this world is an expression of the same divinity, because the divinity is present in everyone, in everything. Then one may ask the question, what about this empirical world? The body, mind complex, trees and mountains and valleys, the empirical phenomenal world. So he said all these are just relative or impermanent realities. They are not permanent, they are impermanent. In the sense, they come and they go, they change. Things subject to changes cannot be called the absolute reality, they are only relative. And they call Maya. Maya means something that is existing before we realize that there is one supreme truth alone, everything else is relative. Now, Vallabha did not accept this. Vallabha was more realistic. There was not much great idealism in Vallabhacharya. See, essentially it is a very emotional, devotional cult. Certain practices, certain disciplines, certain ways of rituals and worship, all these are very, very important according to Vallabha. So, and again, whatever we do, whatever actions we do, there are some limitations. For example, he says, Phaladane karmapeksha, karmagarane prayatnapeksha, prayatno kamapeksha, kame pravahapeksha, idi maryada rakshartham vedam chagara, etc. No, it's a very interesting karmanurupam phalam. Vallabhacharya says, suppose you are meditating on God, you are worshipping on God. All these are restricted in one way or other. You want to do some good action. When you do something, you may expect something in return. That is his limitation. So, phaladane karma apeksha, karmagarane prayatna apeksha. And then if you want to do something, you have to make a lot of effort. It involves a lot of physical, mental strain. And when you make any effort, there will be always some desire behind it. Prayatne kama apeksha, kame pravaha apeksha. Iti maryada rakshatam vedam chakara. So, maryada means, there is an important word in Vallabha's philosophy. Maryada means our normal doing puja, doing some kind of service. All these are good, but they have some limitation. They have some minor drawbacks. When we do something, we may be expecting something in return. And also, any action that we do involves some effort. When we make an effort, there will be some desire behind it. We want to fulfill a desire, so we want to do certain things and we want to enjoy the result. There is some kind of a connection, some limitation, some drawback. On the other hand, suppose you sit in your room and you give entire responsibility of your own spiritual destiny to God. I leave it to you. If it is sincere, then you are completely freed, liberated from this entanglement of your own karmas. If you may be doing something, there may be a problem, but you are not responsible. Why? Because you are given entire responsibility to God. You are doing puja. Maybe the flowers are broken. The offering you are making may not be good. If you are practicing Maryada means the normal, law-bound spiritual disciplines. Puja, worship, services, all these are normal, law-bound spiritual disciplines. When you do that, there are some restrictions and drawbacks. If the fruit that you are offering may not be ripe enough or may be overripe, may be rotten. So I have offered to the Lord some fruit that is rotten. You may feel, oh, I made a mistake. Suppose you dedicate your heart and mind and thoughts and your soul to God, then you are freed from this feeling, well, I made a mistake by offering a rotten flower, a rotten fruit. Or I may have chanted a devotional hymn. My pronunciation was bad. If we change the pronunciation, meaning can be different. So whatever may be the drawback in our normal spiritual disciplines, those drawbacks are important. They affect the results so long as we have not surrendered, ourselves entirely to God. But when the moment we surrender, when we perform the self-surrender, according to Vallabhacharya, Sri Krishna Sharanam Mama. Sri Krishna is my refuge. If you take this strong conviction, then you do everything. Then maybe the fruit that you are offering may not be good, but your heart is pure. Lord will accept you. So it is a kind of hotline, actually, spiritual hotline. Very forceful, very powerful doctrine of Vallabhacharya. So as I mentioned, as a spiritual discipline, it has got a great spiritual potential. Anyone who may feel, well, I did not live my life properly, I did something wrong, or I did not make use of the opportunities I received for my spiritual progress. I did not do justice to myself. While somebody who may feel I led a indisciplined life, they can offer themselves to the Lord sincerely, self-surrender. That moment, the devotee becomes a tool in the hands of God. He becomes a recipient of the grace of God. That is what is called Pushti Marga. So we'll continue this discussion. The Vallabhacharya system is very, very important from a spiritual perspective, because he has offered before us, he has presented before us a very wonderful, unique, practical spiritual discipline. You can find in Shankaracharya Bhavani Ashtagam, Gadistum Tamega Bhavani, etc. You find. But in Vallabha's times, it had a great cultural and political relevance and significance. As I mentioned, when I quoted from Krishna's Stotram, he says, these days society is changing, adharma is taking Of course, along with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's system also was equally a product of his Vallabhacharya were living. So you can see many similarities. Now, before we conclude, I make an announcement. We have a very important celebration on Thursday, October 31st, 7:30 p.m. That is Kali Puja, Divine Mother Kali Puja, worship of Divine Mother Kali. We celebrate, is a very important holy occasion, the worship of Divine Mother Kali on Thursday, October 31st, 7:30 p.m. at the new temple, 2323 Vallabhacharya Street, San Francisco. There will be worship, devotion, singing, reading from scriptures and refreshments. The temple also will be open for meditation until 10:30 p.m. All of you are most welcome. Now we can have an interaction on Vallabhacharya system. We will continue this discussion in the next class because from a spiritual perspective, it has got a deep significance because it actually gives an alternative for every spiritual seeker to change his life and his destiny if he sincerely wants. Anytime, any moment, one can start a new spiritual life. That's the greatness of Vallabha's Pushti mark. So thank you very much. Namaskar. We can have interaction. Most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Maharaj. Yeah. Thank you very much. Sri Ram, please go ahead.
Yeah.
For Prapatti you need Anya Gatit. Is what you use
Ananya Gatitwam. Ananya, Anya, but Ananya, the opposite of Ananya Gatitwa means there is no other refuge. That strong conviction. So, Akinchanyam, Ananya Gatitwam. These are two important principles of Ramanuja's philosophy of total self-surrender. So, what it means is one should have a total sincere conviction that I cannot take care of my own spiritual destiny. You feel that you are a destitute, you're totally helpless. The second important aspect of this doctrine is that you have no other refuge. You take refuge only in God. If these two ideas are combined, it is called the Prapatti according to Ramanuja. In reality, the same description goes for Vallabha's system also. The point is, in Vallabha's system, it has got a more force because he says, when the social, political circumstances make it impossible for anyone to practice spiritual discipline, you are totally helpless, then he says, Sri Krishna Sharanamama. So very interesting, remember, so there is a deep pathos in Vallabha's system. Ramanuja also was not much more lucky, almost 120 years after Ramanuja's life, Ramanuja left his body, the Srirangam temple where Ramanuja lived, the temple was ransacked by Malik Kafur, who was a military general of Alauddin Khilji. And actually, Sudip Prakashika is a commentary on Ramanuja's Sribhashya. There was only one copy, and Ramanuja's follower, Sudarsana Suri, he was holding that copy to his heart, had to hide among the dead bodies. And that is how the book was spared. Today you can read it because of one man saved that book. Pretend he lay on, and the dead bodies pretend to be dead. So Ramanuja also not less lucky. So you can find many of the Vaishnava system, Ramanuja system, Nimbarka system, Vallabha system, and also Chaitanya system. Chaitanya and Vallabha they were contemporaries more or less. Actually they met, they had discussions, they also met, there is no doubt about it. So maybe just a few years Vallabha was senior, but anyway. So the point is, in many of the Vaishnava system you can find this force of the circumstances, the social upheaval, the political upheaval, the violent times of their life can be reflected in some of their doctrines. Okay, thank you.
So the Ananya Gatitwam, to develop it, it seems like from the sadhana chatushtaya you need nitya vastu viveka, you need mumukshutvam, and you need vairagya.
See, that applies to Advaita only, or Vedantic disciplines. When you really surrender yourself to God's grace, then all these qualities become natural to you. Sadhana sadhushtaya sampatti, as you understand, becomes natural when you surrender yourself to God. When you do that sincerely, then a strong desire for spiritual emancipation, then self-control, sense control, self-control, mind control, controlling of your own senses, all these become natural to you. And not only that, then you will care only for the higher spiritual principles, and you will discard everything else. All this becomes natural to you when you sincerely surrender yourself to God. You see, actually real surrender happens not by declaration, but it's an inner silent process. It happens in our.
On the other hand, you develop these sadhana chatushtaya, then you will result in surrender to God.
No, sadhana sadhushtaya sampatti is, I told you, it is special to Advaitic tradition. It is Shankaracharya explained the Viveka Chudamani, where he explains this. In a way, it is common to all spiritual seekers, but in Vaishnavite systems, it is not mentioned in so many words. But in spiritual life, when you surrender yourself to this higher spiritual ideal, you actually become endowed with sadhana sadhushtaya sampatti. It becomes natural to you. Suppose you sincerely surrender yourself to God, then you won't go after worldly things. So that is nitya vastu viveka. And you also will have a sense of sense control, self-control, equanimity of mind, samadhi sukha sampatti. And you have a strong desire for spiritual liberation, God's grace. So all will become natural. So in Vedantic tradition, you are in control of your own spiritual destiny. But in Vaishnava tradition, once you surrender, then you join the flow. It's just like boarding a moving train. When you board a train that is moving, you don't run in that train. Even if you run, you won't reach earlier than the train. Point? When you suppose you board a moving bus, a bus that's already moving, then you don't have to run in the bus. The bus is moving already. So if you totally surrender, then all these qualities become natural to you.
You have a durable surrender. To truly surrender, you need a sadhana chatushtaya.
No. Actually, Vallabhacharya's speciality is you cannot have any kind of self-control sadhana sampatti. But you want it. But you are totally helpless. So he says, I put the whole responsibility to God. That happens. If you look at the life of so many Tulsidas in Indian tradition, many of the great mystics of Christian tradition, are great examples. So at the spiritual level, there is no restriction to one particular religious tradition or not. All these great, we can Saint Paul if we call, or Saint Francis of Assisi, Saint Augustine, examples, great examples. They were not very saintly people before the transformation. So they didn't have this sadhana sampatti. But in Advaita Vedanta it's different. So many of these mystics are classical examples of Vallabha's system, the force of Vallabha, the relevance of Vallabha's philosophy, Pushti Marga. But one should be very sincere. It requires a lot of integrity, sincerity, honesty. You cannot, otherwise, I tell you something very funny. Among many of these communities, they make this kind of formal surrender, but it doesn't have much impact on their life. Just like you may be a priest going and confess, you may be trying to be a Christian, only in an attempt to become a Christian, you confess. But after confession, again you continue. Confession becomes, as I mentioned, a license, renewal program. It doesn't have any permanent impact. So the real self-surrender requires a lot of integrity, strong determination, and total and complete honesty and sincerity. Then only it really works. Otherwise it becomes a caricature, it becomes a drama. That's the problem of this path. But Vallabha's system produced many saintly people, because there were many great spiritual seekers in that tradition who became saintly, great saints, because some of them, they were very sincere. But again, many of these systems have the problem, the risk of being reduced to some kind of a caricature or a meaningless convention. Then they will lose all their spiritual significance. That's a problem. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank you.
David, please proceed.
Yeah.
Unmute yourself. There you go.
Hello, Swami.
Yeah.
My internet connection is not doing great today, so I might disappear on you.
Yeah, okay.
You're coming across clearly. I saw you rebooted, so
Yeah.
here you are.
Yeah, no, it's binary, all or none.
Yeah.
In this particular problem.
Yeah.
So, my question is, you mentioned earlier the importance of a positive attitude in this system. Could you explain what that means?
Oh yeah, it's an attempt to connect our mind to ideas and associations which are conducive to spiritual life. And we should also try to avoid any association or any ideas which may not be conducive, which may not be helpful to our spiritual life. So it requires some effort. So this effort requires our own determination, our own conscious effort. But once you practice this path of grace, then you don't have to make any real effort on your part. But you have to pay a heavy price, because you have to be totally sincere. You can imagine St. Augustine was completely sincere, so he underwent a complete transformation. St. Francis of Assisi, St. Paul, or anybody for the matter, many of the mystics. So, the price we have to pay is very heavy. Why? Because you have to be totally 100% sincere. Then it's a hotline. Otherwise, we should slowly work hard, move forward slowly. That's the spiritual force of Vallabha's system. That's why, Vallabha's system sometimes can be ridiculed by many other critics. Pushti means nourishment. So they made fun of his system. It's kind of a Epicurean, hedonistic, you eat, according to some of the classical hedonist thinkers, you eat and enjoy and pleasure, that's the only purpose of human existence, that sort of thing. So they used to make fun of them. Actually, some of the followers must have done something to justify this criticism, maybe. But it produced many saintly people, many people who were devotees. In a way, the Pushti Marga of Vallabha, you can find the traces of the same idea in all great spiritual traditions of Judaism or Christianity or Buddhism, everywhere you find. I can give you an example, and one example that is frequently quoted. Poshanam is an element in the Bhagavata Purana. One example is given in Bhagavata Purana itself to illustrate the force of this. There was a man, his name was Ajamila. So it is explained, it is described in one section of the Bhagavata Purana called Ajamila Vakhyanam, the exposition of the story of Ajamila, the name of a person. He was born in a very pious family. He led a very pure, pious, disciplined life till he was 22 years old. And then he was married, of course, and then he had a great fall in his life, a deviation from the path of dharma. So what happened, he became a a profligate, a drunkard, a shame to his family, his community. And finally, the time came for him to die. At that time, the story goes like this. So, the Vishnu's messengers came to take his soul to Vishnu Loka. And the messengers from hell also came because he had done a lot of terrible things. So they thought he deserves to go to hell. This is a mythological story. This is an interesting thing. So some messengers came from hell to claim his body. Some messengers came from heaven to claim his body. This is a dialogue between these two people. The messengers who came from hell and the messengers who came from heaven. So those who came from the hell said, this fellow led such a nasty life. He deserves to go to hell. But then the messengers came from heaven. No, you should go to heaven. You know the reason they gave? When he was about to die, he remembered his son's name. His son's name was Narayana. Now, Narayana is a synonym for God in Vaishnava tradition. He did not think of calling God's name, but the name was given to his son. Narayana is one of the synonyms of God. So what happened was, when he, without intention, he called his son to come near him at the time of death. Incidentally, the thought of the holy name, the same name that he used to utter as a small little boy, when he was growing up as a pious, humble person, that memory came back to him. And he died. So that single chanting of God's name saved his life. So the messengers came from heaven, Vishnu Loka, and wanted to take him to heaven. Why? Because he uttered one name once with total dedication. He remembered sincerely the holy name that he used to chant while meditating on God when he was very young, before he had this deviation in his life. So this is given as an example. So if a person had done terrible thing in his life, but last moment, with total sincerity, 100% sincerity, repentance, if he takes the name of God, that one little spiritual practice will remove all the sins, will neutralize all the negative samskaras or of his evil deeds, and will be the cause of his spiritual liberation. This is given as an example. So what it means is, if a person sincerely chants the name of God or does any kind of spiritual discipline, which actually is kind of total self-surrender. With the idea of total self-surrender, he uttered a name. So he became a recipient of God's grace. So that is the essence of Vallabha's system of philosophy. Total sincerity is needed. Then it removes all negative samskaras. But to have that level of sincerity and honesty, you should have already deposited a lot of spiritual tendencies in your mental system. Otherwise, that level of sincerity may not be easy for anyone to reach. That's the idea behind. It's a kind of spiritual hotline that Vallabha preached in his books. Okay.
Thank you, Maharaj. David lost his connection but has returned. I wonder if he heard some of the audio live or we'll hear it later.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, as David reconnects, I have a question about the idea of this complete sincere surrender, and the idea that you offer the mantra Shri Krishna Sharanam Mama.
Sure.
So the story of Girish Chandra Ghosh comes to mind.
Exactly,
His
yeah.
complete power of attorney to Sri Ramakrishna.
Yeah.
And his brilliant dramatist and genius.
Yeah.
He surrenders completely and says, "You lead. You take care of this." And because he's in distress.
Yeah.
His desperation is complete, just like you were saying.
Yeah.
Was the historical context.
Yeah.
For Vallabhacharya's impetus. And yet it's hard to imagine that Girish Chandra Ghosh would have been able to continue being productive in his other life's work, his theatrical mission.
Yeah.
He would have surrendered under Vallabha's system.
Yeah.
And he would have in a way rescued himself.
Yeah.
But would he have been able to be as independently vibrant under that system?
Yeah. No, that's true. So he was a dramatist. He was a playwright. And he had a great genius for creative writing. Along with that, he had many vices. So when he surrendered himself completely to God, what happened was his creative skills remained intact. Your mind will not go blank. Rather, creativity takes a higher leap forward. Creativity becomes more creative in a spiritual sense. It becomes more creative. So you are right. Girish Chandra Ghosh, when he totally surrendered himself to Sri Ramakrishna, he must have felt like if you're floating in a river, which you don't have to make your own effort to move forward. The wind, the current is making you move forward without your own effort. So that current took him in the proper direction, and as part of that movement, as mentioned, he could still produce many creative writings. So our mind doesn't go blank. This is an important point to remember. Our tendencies, samskaras linked to creativity will remain intact. But tendencies and samskaras which are negative, which actually made him an alcoholic, a drunkard, those samskaras are neutralized, but creative, positive samskaras, they remain intact. In fact, they become more vibrant. Actually, any kind of spiritual association will give our mind a higher focus, a deeper insight into nature of whatever we are doing, currently engaged in. If you are a lawyer, if you are a poet, if you are a medical practitioner, or if you are an artist, if you are a musician, whatever it is, all those higher skills will get a higher focus, a higher level of intensity, spiritual intensity, creative intensity when you connect with spirituality. That doesn't leave our mind blank. All negative cobwebs are removed. Creative skills are kept intact. I often compare this, for example. Think of a situation. Suppose Fyodor Dostoevsky had a Sri Ramakrishna as a guru. Just imagine. Girish Chandra Ghosh was on a smaller scale, much smaller scale. He was. Please don't mind my smaller scale, because Fyodor Dostoevsky's creative writing is so epic, mind-boggling compared to his mental condition. So it's all the more so. Girish Chandra Ghosh, he had this association with Sri Ramakrishna. So he could understand the spiritual power of Sri Ramakrishna. So he himself said, if I can undergo such a transformation by Sri Ramakrishna's association, how great should be Sri Ramakrishna's power? So I was just thinking about it. Suppose you think of somebody like who could write Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky, in Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky wrote. A man who could write such a matchless masterpiece in Western literary tradition. if you had somebody like Sri Ramakrishna to bless him, or a Christ like bless him, but how great he would have become. So it's a mind-boggling to even imagine that. You are right. Spiritual association, or what we call the total self-surrender in spiritual life, it gives a higher intensity. It makes our skills more sublime in their creative effectiveness of the creative activity, really speaking. Okay.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Yeah.
The Bhakti traditions and Vallabha's traditions are also very closely associated with very sublime poetry.
Yeah.
So I don't want to fail to acknowledge that.
Yeah. Thank you.
The American poetic tradition seems to be closer to the Advaita Vedanta approach, because the freedom of poets like Walt Whitman, for example, are unimaginable if he had surrendered himself to the extent called for by the Vallabha tradition.
Yeah.
So although it is interesting that you said that in times of abject desperation, it's very important to have these alternatives.
Yeah.
Because it's important to have something to turn to.
Yeah. I think many of the great cultural traditions did have, but only we don't hear about them. Because some of the great creative writings were born in difficult times when great writers, great thinkers, great poets were compelled to become introspective. And out of this introspective mindset alone can come out great creative works, art, literature, and tradition also. I sincerely believe a great man like Einstein, I don't know, see, he could see something so farther into the world of physics because of the difficult times he had to encounter during his migration from Germany coming to the United States. Think of that, because I think these difficult times must have given him an idea of the limitation of all that we consider as precious and worthwhile and wonderful. Things are not so wonderful. So that forces you to look beyond the world of the senses, the world of sense pleasures, the world of whatever you see around you. And that gives you a deep insight into something that is transcendental, or trans-empirical, so to speak.
I have no doubt that's true, Maharaj.
Yeah. So
there are no further questions. I think that might be...
So thank you so much. Thank you. You're most welcome. We'll continue Vallabha system next class also. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Pranamastu.